조제 조나라 장조바 돌라 벤제 상젠 조바 쇼 상제 최단 소제 조남나 장조바도 단에 접소제 다게 돌라 벤제 상젠 조바 쇼 Tiorbe, ale, correct. Lada. Maitola.
Kesal haba, kengi dinte chik songshas. Soso chanju semba macha padu, chanju semba ki gyula tokpa kare yome soso la shinku reshas. Din nyamdu tanda soso gyula tokpa kia la pegi soso la gewe shenye nyam, koso tokpa gyunden ki kansa chikores. Ine kansa shengi gyula tokpa kare yome soso ki tache man tudu. Ani gewe shenye, ta soso gyula tokpa kia ki dunda la gewe shenye tsega dudu, ta sudan su gyula tokpa kare yome kande tache gores. Odi tire. So the question is, last Wednesday, in answering questions, it was explained that unless we are bodhisattvas ourselves, knowing the realizations of a bodhisattva is extremely hidden phenomena. Separately, it was stated that in order to gain realizations ourselves, we must rely on a spiritual mentor who has already realized what we seek to realize. If we are strongly intent on realizing uncontrived bodhicitta, how can we select a reliable spiritual mentor who has this realization if we are unable to know if they have realized it or not?
다디 티워디 남균이 레디고래 기비신이 체가 들베갑라 아니 간사 파루부기 심규기 똑바디 맞으시에 두고 말봐 맞을 소소를 꼬도 교디기로 다 파루부 똑바 신이바 간디지 요메 디 미셰바이나 아니 다 간디신 체고래서 남규 티워디 맞을 남균이 레디 티워드래 다 딜라 남규 덴데 숭기요래 단당 아주 대다 양다 가도 되라 대다 양다 가도 되라 아주 베이 따지고요로와 도발레니 메시에도 주견레니 추시에도 아니 된게 따되라 전주 셈볼로 된게 리니 체마달리 시에세제 소자다 디 카도기 슝기 제바레 남규 라마 고마주 송규라 카리어스 라베나 다 장주기 셈디 투규레 여담에 맞을 거도 교버레데 아니 디기 장주기 셈 규레 여버 디기 릉하기 딱 세마지여 봐 딩가졸라 다 통투해지여레 다 릉하기 딱디 장주기 셈 투규레 여버 릉하기 딱 인다 면세야라 응가라 또 소소 롭준 채워지기로 봐. 응가라 장주기 셈다. 인지 첨보다 주기 연된다. 아니 덴데 줄이게베이나 아니 룽하기 타니 믹스와 간데 용기 유메 슝기 나로라 삭버도 따탄다. 도든조 나로라 장주 셈바기 아니 룽하기 타니기 체마 간데 용기 유메 슝기 나로 송여로 와. 응가라 된조 아니 퇴버체 아니 퇴버체네 아니 다 소소기 장주심 좀 담보슈즈기 라마텔 롱하게 타니 아니 슝니 숨바나시기 다 체마 대도 튠바든데 드니 도민도 세제드니 딱지체들에 딜 롱하게 타니 때고 렌직 레니자 마임바 코 따투버식 아주 슝니 나라 송기요래 배낭 아주 chirmidobe topopoe kablayang azu chirmidobe tashe lungagi tashe chi yungudwa ina di ta de la ko chirmidoba yimbe ta de ko rinyi sam chungwa keje mimbache ko lungagi thanye de ta thubachi yungdegi yoba dendeji yungboina ani kansa parubu de gyula ta changjugi semgi nyongwa misiji yobachi ngazo ta chöba thugu yorwa ta changjugi semgi di 가르세 오래 룽하기 타니 단다 시용도 슝기 나로라 아니 닝지 친구기 딱 체마되라 되네 심진 동에게 나와 통화 잡게 되니 쇠미도 봐 쇠미도 봐 되니 그 류기 바보 당로야 미니 치마 투로야 어떤지 슝구여 봐 되네 상계다 다 심계기 토모마이 딱 체마마 시윤데 아니 상계기 사이 윤되는 좀마 죄용도 되니 미니 치마 투로야 류기 바보 당로야 어떤지도 룽하게 타니기 다시기여 다 텔라 때네 아니 바로부터 줄에 창조기 셈이 영화 또 미세션도 면다가지 요바디 도시는 보조래
even though it's true that one cannot realize exactly what the realizations of someone else are, this question about if it is true that one cannot know what realization someone has, then how does one rely on someone hoping that they have the realizations that are appropriate with the ones that one seeks, is a question that commonly comes up and has been asked many times. Generally, when one studies, this question comes up a lot. And the common answer, what is generally explained, is that even though the realizations or the mental qualities are hidden to one, you can infer the presence of those qualities through certain evidence, which we call correct evidence signs, resultant or correct effect evidence, where through the presence of an effect, then you infer the presence of its cause, which is the realization that they have. And so even though the mental qualities are hidden to us, we can infer them through the evidence of other effects. And the effects that arise from these inner qualities are signs that one can observe, which are physical or verbal signs. And so firstly, to be able to infer that such a realization exists, one needs to at least be familiar with what it entails for one to have developed a certain quality, whether it is Bodhicitta or else. One has to have oneself trained a little bit and have some sort of experience of what it is. And then, like it says in the sutras, when you hear and when you understand what the kind of signs are that result from having these inner realizations, which one has now somewhat familiarized with and has an inkling of what these realizations might be and what they might result in, then one looks at the person that one is checking or analyzing to see if they're an appropriate spiritual guide, and you try and see if they physically and verbally manifest these signs. And the manifestation of these signs is not that every now and then, on certain occasions, they manifest these physical signs, but that these signs are repeatedly manifested whenever they come in contact with certain situations. And so the physical signs is that they say their hair stands on end, they have goosebumps, and that they start crying uncontrollably. And so in the sutras, the Buddha has this quote where he says, through the presence of smoke you can infer fire, through water birds you can infer water. The realizations of bodhisattvas can be inferred through these signs. And so the signs over here are these physical signs where one starts crying uncontrollably because one is so moved, not being able to bear seeing the suffering of sentient beings. And so when you meet someone who, when they come in contact with the suffering of sentient beings, they cry uncontrollably. or they get so moved that their hair stands on end and they get goosebumps, and this doesn't happen on 1 or 2 occasions but is a constant phenomenon that you can observe, then that is considered having such a sign. So indications of someone having generated loving kindness are that when they see the suffering of sentient beings, not being able to bear that suffering, they manifest these physical and verbal signs. When someone has bodhicitta in them, what the same signs, the physical and verbal signs, they can be seen when they are hearing. So when such a person who has generated bodhicitta hears the mention of the qualities of the Buddha, or the features that a Buddha has, or the qualities that a Buddha possesses, the attributes of a Buddha, when they hear the attributes of the Buddhas, then people who have developed bodhicitta, they start crying. And again, they're moved physically and verbally, you can see that. And so, when you have these kind of specific signs, and these signs are not just once or twice, but they are constant, then through the presence of these kind of reactions, one can infer that they have that resultant, the causal realization which results in these kind of displays.
Mazu puramgi ro yorwa, puramgi ro nyong yongde, puramgi shumbagi ro dan, ane puram korong one korangi ro ni barula chejung keba shu shego ro da. So puramgi ro ngoma di nyong so na, dindegi nyong degi ro ngarmuji yorwa. O diso ro cheje, shumbi ro nyong so ro ma imbache, puramgi ro ngoma nyong so ro cheje. Kansa parubu digi chanjugi seminare, nijungi samba inare, yangtabi tawa inare, kandar ko tsigi kowa chakwa tsam, ko dinde tsam mayi kuda kandar yujugi kowa dinde tsam mayi ba sem dingni ngeshe nyebi soro watan, dine sem dingni korang la puramgi ro nyongwa na shingi tsorbaji yoba ina, tela pabi taadi mindawa chigi dan, korangi ngani ma tuen yungyoge, dine nijung shangsa yangtabi tawa ki damba chigi ma tuen ba ina ya, ko tsik pyoju chirandi ko shenpa de chigwa re, namju tsik yang yang de ko tue de, tekharang re de, ina di pa ma sungdang di da susu kowabu di nyen yun de, ko mindawa chig yor da, di nga zo tsoba chi tuye chi yor di.
For instance, if you have sugarcane, there's the bark of sugarcane which is also sweet. If you chew on the bark, it has a sweet taste. And the sugarcane inside also is sweeter. It's a lot sweeter. So when the person outside, when you're looking at someone else, and you're trying to understand whether they have, whether it be loving kindness or bodhicitta or a realization of emptiness, there is someone who has an understanding which is an intellectual understanding, maybe that has been derived solely through the word. So you have an understanding which is kind of analogous to having tasted the sweetness of sugarcane by only chewing on the bark. But someone who has, even though it might be an understanding that is because it is an understanding that is uncontrived, which is comparable to not chewing on the bark or tasting the bark of sugarcane, but tasting it inside, which is where the real sweet flavor is, even though such a person may speak the same words and say the same things that everybody else says, because that is more or less how it is going to be described, because their understanding or their realizations are not contrived or they're not requiring any effort and they have become natural and spontaneous, much like someone who has tasted the real essence of sugarcane, even though they speak the same way, when they speak and the way in which they speak, and when someone is listening, one can understand or one can even observe and verify that there is a marked difference between how this thing, how this teaching or how this concept is transmitted or explained to someone else.
Penangazo mila tsingen sheba inda tsingen ba kongdo tingni kongdo sa dinge ji tsingen ba sheba ina di tsingen ba digi ngazo namgi negative energy se yo mi paro bu digi sortu esto subula susu nyongwe tone sortu eji yerda o diso rawo cheje kandar 장조기 셈 두규를 영어 무수야 총딩이 지게 되는 마송 용도 나로 난기 똑버디기 난기 똑버디기 니버서로디 칠로로 마 퇴네 가사 바로부터 즉 소르트해지 열다
much like someone who is genuinely angry and very worked up, when they speak certain words and they speak angry or kind of unpleasant words, when they say unpleasant things, when the words that they're speaking are backed by or they have an underlying strong anger, so a strong emotional state of anger, when you hear such words, you can kind of feel, you can almost feel the negative energy that this person is transmitting to you because of the anger that underlies their speech. Similarly, when someone has a realization or someone has realized and actualized bodhicitta, the fact that they have actualized bodhicitta and that they possess it and it is an active state, when they speak similar to the angry words, there's a certain energy that gets transmitted and you can experience it from someone who has this kind of realization.
딱 강사 바로부 디 귤어 잔주기 쌤 영화께 되버요나 디기 뉴버디 맞아 포지티브 에너지 세지어 봐디 띵안조 미기 소르트에 여바 가르슬라나 미점도 마세 두루세양 디 소르트고 열세 워다 중지 쉬어베나다 자버드 rum부시 다 계란조 망보지 퇴용용이 구산람이 샬론 제나게 자버드 rum시 다 코란 chanju semba che tu yundune ta chanju sem jong damba til du zen ni nyamne na de kengi ta kibu samgi mi chaba kibu damba chung chen ro ba sora koran kap ji rituela an do che ji shub de kap ji la ni khong la ngoshe yo ba ta kan da namda di na lo da tene khongi ngoshe gi du sik che ngomba ji gi tene shawa ji la da gyap this daddy po yundu ani shawa twechi ta ngombe shawa de techinje shawa manirta ngombe shawa mani shawa twechinje shawa jema simba yundu ani shawa twechinje ani zabdong de ji na lola ta ko du chije shawa de dela de dinji la kharje ani la de bche ta de daddy su de bche digi su sana shu yode de dinji zabudrum ji kenje Dini Korangi da Zabadrum Korana Shabji shooting da Yoro Shabji Jorwa, Dike Danji, Keram Dinipa Chinda and Penima Zablonji Yores, Dela Shawaji Dinin Dasuk Didu, Dikeran Kali Chinji Dadi Koshos. Ani Dakeran Pagitile Lay Yundi Ko Ngomba Dileris and Ngamdagi Ko Truzishigris. So Ko Truzishidu and Kerangi Kechumbo Gabse. Zabadrum which is 10 Disungur. Ujinji Michugo Wombo.
So, the fact that through such a realization, when someone has this experience, or they have this realization and then they communicate or they talk about bodhicitta, it's not just humans who can perceive that someone has this feeling or they have generated this mental state, but even animals can. So there's a story to narrate such a story. Most of you have heard of Dza Patru Rinpoche. He's written this famous text which we call in English, it's the Words of My Perfect Teacher. And he was commonly renowned to be a bodhisattva. And there's a story where once when he was in retreat, because he was clairvoyant, he saw that a hunter had shot an arrow at a deer and the deer had run away. And then the hunter was trying to catch the deer, but he was unable to find it. And when the deer had escaped and the hunter couldn't find it, the deer, however, went and kind of fell down and got stuck. And so when Patru Rinpoche saw this, he told his attendant to go to the deer, and he said, when you go to the deer and take out the arrow, then you'll notice that the deer is going to get jumpy or nervous because it's going to think that it's going to get caught. And at that point, just discreet, like loudly pronounce my name, which is Ogyen Jigmechugi Wambo, which was Dza Patru Rinpoche's name. And by saying this name loudly, then the deer calmed down, and just from having heard Patru Rinpoche's name.
Oh, dear. So that good changes some 2 yul no year debina. What that did 2 yul year digging changes somebody got sent to about some young co mixigi the yedeva. But the any shenema damba tumba ina, tigi co missigi yorta, missigi. That you call de so tebatos, Gachambo de che, and do sim ding ne tunye gi dumba yoba chen do suma shiba ina dinzo yang nyongwe tun ra chue ji yorda ko jumjin shiba ge she yo ma de nyongwe tun ra chue dir.
So like in this example, by merely hearing the name of someone who has generated this state, apparently this deer was able to calm down and then they could heal it. When someone has this kind of realization inside and you come in contact with them and you yourself have heard about bodhicitta, whatever realization you seek, if you have heard about it, you have thought about it and you have cultivated it within yourself and you have tried to actualize it or you have some experience with it, then your experience of this thing and your search and your wish to actualize it or perfect it, when you come in contact with someone who has actually actualized it, even though you can't really explain rationally what happens between these two, your own familiarity and your experience coupled with their uncontrived realization, there is a way in which this kind of gets communicated between the two people. Tanda padu kyamuru muchegi sangi gi tempa tseya ta ani tso tanda zambulin di nalola sangi ta kyamuru muchegi tuje karin la tene nancho da kyap cheya ta nancho la dona la dipe mombo yom de shas ta kyamuru muche namshi tanda gomba zo du ani tanda ngate semde chigi do semde chigi yong dos ani gere muche tanda chö sunyen dan choma wa chayandu gere muchegi kyamuru muche mebe do ti la khande chagi yume khande gongi yonas ani gengi tanda densan chö shegen dang chö lamnyen denzo la mikse gi tude nangi yume dang ani konzo la labja chi nango chuna gen labja khare na sares
ta nge so roj khare labja kya horda ta ine nge gi gen la nge gen kadyu nu tude nangirta ta tanda sangi ye tembala chik tönye gi dumba daw dan dine chik lobjun she gi dumba dan chik tos chik ye debati ta jawar mi tuje ga ring yajil dine chung debachi gengi kadune song digre tadi ko ngobi nujula shib sawu do debaina dagarang tu dinge do jure ta jema kyangom ji mashu kapdene ji kesona ta dinang shingi sangye gi temba jingyong chedan de dinang shin ji ta gugu yoroba andi samju shinge ji machung boina ani da shuji sangye gi temba shuji nyamgire sejeda gen turi shunang gire kadina di kamedin de ba jungbe kadula di shado shola di kame kadina di tönang gi do gengi da jema be khawchi gres o dende gengi yangsen de son digre.
So the question is, His Holiness is the tallest figure of Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism worldwide. What he has done for the world with his advocacy of universal responsibility, love and compassion is unprecedented. But I cannot help but worry sometimes about the time when he will have been gone. As Dharma teachers, propagators of Buddha's teachings, how do you envision the world without him? Do you feel especially responsible as Dharma teachers? And what would be your message to people who feel connected to His Holiness? Ale, ani kyamuru muche dan chunde shun yungen denzo la yangen la chakara na sares. Kyamuru muche mashu bekab la kyamuru muche dan chunde yungen denzo juro lage. Ani Quran so lage la chakara na sares. Tamandirish. So first, what I say or what advice I might have is not particularly relevant, but my teacher, he's always very concerned about this point, because he always says that anyone who has even the slightest interest or the wish to follow the Dharma or the teachings is inspired or motivated to do so solely through the kindness of His Holiness and through His Holiness's activity. And the fact that this is the case, if one checks a little closely and analyzes, you can actually see that it's true that we all derive our interest and our enthusiasm or our appreciation for the Dharma through His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so my teacher keeps saying, when he's not there, when His Holiness is no longer there, then we'll need someone who can make this connection or who can make this happen for us. But because His Holiness is not there, then someone like that is lacking. And so my teacher, he always brings this up whenever we meet or whenever we're talking. This always manages to come and become part of the conversation, where he mentions how he's so worried that when His Holiness is no longer there, this is an inevitable situation.
Tang yes roji labja ke gyathoya koron ke yamar nganzu mi gyathoya koron ke yamare. Ta redi ina yang karso gore. Sanje gi temba ngone ziye di lungdo gi temba ni ta lungi temba shung denyu sum chenye che ya an tobe temba nyamsu lenche ko susu tuju la drube yunde ke ta dinyi ju gone sanje gi temba zingyong pesum cheji ma do tele shemba da shem me tele shemba ji me ba di da shemba shen kari cheba yina da kanda ko gyune ko kale kale pendo yunga keje she chogure de kanda sanje gi temba zingyong pesum chegi ko di chatu merwa.
I'm in really no position to say anything or give any advice on something like this. That's not something that I'm qualified to do or I can do in any way. But when we speak of upholding the teachings of the Buddha, when we speak of the teachings of the Buddha, we speak of two kinds. There are the verbal teachings or the textual teachings of the Buddha, and then there is the realization that ensues from those. So when we talk about the teachings in terms of how we envision the teachings as the scriptural teachings of the Buddha, then we talk about the three baskets. But for those three baskets to be continuing and for those three baskets to be real, then the resultant realizations of what is mentioned in those three baskets also have to be present. So for upholding the teachings of the Buddha and propagating the teachings of the Buddha, it's the scriptural ones and the realizations of that scriptural teaching. Whatever other benefit one might do, it could indirectly or in some other kind of supportive manner be of benefit to the continuing or the long remaining of the Dharma, but nothing else outside of these two really benefits the teaching of the Dharma. So the upholding of the scriptural tradition and the realizations that one should have.
Ta lungi temba chenyengo ne da zingu yore ta töba chenye gugu yorwa töba chenye gugu yore ta töba chenye gugu yoba yindi töba chedandi nganzo jirdangi lobsin shamba lobjun sheba na shingi töba chedandi mare de na shingi lobjun chedan shungi shamba karso orda lobsin shamba yorwa nganzo tsiri da angji jangbe sodo dendegi lobjongi töba chedan lobjon chedan sodo oji töba nganzo töba chedan de dendeji kana chimba ina di sangye temba lungi temba jintok mare lungi temba shung de nesum chenyin jugon zin se di yung mare.
So even when we talk about upholding the scriptural teachings of the Buddha, the scriptural teachings, for that to be upheld, one has to engage in hearing the teachings, and so one has to listen to the teachings. But then when we say listen to the teachings, it's also extremely important to realize that the way in which one listens to the teachings of the Buddha is not like the way one studies or listens to other subjects. For instance, the way in which we listen to subjects such as math or science, if we take our study of the Dharma or listening to the scriptures and we do it and we listen to them with the same attitude and in the same manner that we listen to and study on other subjects, then that does not qualify as upholding the scriptural teachings of the Buddha. That's not how they're listened to. That's not how one listens to them.
Sonza da shung de nesum chenyin jugon töba chin zindang töba che de nanglo la zindang di nganzo shung chomogi ma shung chomo khandi je na ma son yonde ani jeja goba 닝게 아니 데와세죠. 간다 고소 취시 주고네 마 디시경 거다.
So when we talk about listening to the teachings, whatever teachings, whatever, especially the great treatises, the great texts that have been written, whenever we talk about them, the great texts, they're presented in a certain, they're divided in this fourfold manner of presentation, which is, there is the subject that is being presented, there is the purpose, there is the final purpose, or like the real heart purpose of that, and then there is how these connect with each other.
당부 슝기 죄자 닝부직 슝기 죄자 용조 멤버시 슝기 죄자기 다 닝부소로직 당부 죄자직 수퇴 되니 죄자 대다 소수 시균이 바로래 다 죄자 디나로스 딱슝 된다 가리 송바디 소수기 냠술랑바이나 고바 가르치기도 아니 타르두기 고바 가르치기도 내급이 고바 가르치기도 다 내급이 고바 디나로라 소수기 심주 투두로야 녀몽충도로야 어딘데기다 고바 고 내급이 고바 타르두기 고바 될라 아니 고 땐도 동엘 줘야 어딘데시 죄자 대다 죄자 텔라 때문에 내급이 고바 가르치기도 타르두기 고바 아니 가장아주 쉬고나시 봉불 하마메 고고 하세요. 딘데지 버도 통제 죄자 고바 닝괴 딘데지 통제 아니 신이 닝괴 될라 미치 아니 슝델라 퇴바체바이나 딘 상계기 때문에 퇴베고는 아주 진야디 룽기 때문에 진야 오네디 차기였다.
So when we talk about the subject, which is the first of these four, the subject, when one listens to the teachings or the scriptural teachings of the Buddha, then the first thing is to have a kind of a summary of the subject. So one has a good idea or a brief idea of the subject matter of that teaching. But then that's not enough just to know what the subject matter is. One also has to be able to connect with how this subject is relevant or what the purpose of the subject is, or what the aim or the goal of this teaching is. And after the goal of it, then there is the final goal, or like the real heart purpose of that teaching. And so then when we hear or we reflect on the teachings, we have to, one, know what they say, which is having gain familiarity with the content or the subject matter. But then after that, one also has to try and understand what the purpose of this teaching is and what the final purpose of this teaching is. And with respect to the immediate purpose, one may have an immediate benefit where one has, like, one feels slightly pleasant, or one might experience some sort of bliss or some peace, and one might be able to temporarily tame or reduce one's afflicted states. And that's an immediate benefit or an immediate purpose of listening to such teachings. But like we've been saying from the beginning, the ultimate purpose, the final purpose of these scriptures, the teachings of the Buddha, is to attain a state of cessation devoid of the contaminated aggregates. So when we have understood the content or the subject matter, we have understood the short-term benefit or the short-term purpose, and we've understood the final goal or the final purpose of these teachings. And wishing to attain that final goal, when we engage in hearing and then we think about it, then that action of hearing the teachings qualifies as upholding the scriptural teachings of the Buddha, not before this.
Pena ngondo gengi chujeji kabla ani yum kemba sumla ta chöbaje teba phyerwa ta di gongba ma de yongde lobi singi sangboge ani kemba sumla tangwa keba ina an dindegi tangwa di lekwa thamchi tobi gyu ani ta zores so kinsung na tangwa di kinsung na tangwa ke de shiragi ta za chumbushi di tangwa di kesona ani lekwa thamchi ta top yungure so da lekwa thamchi tobi gyu ta zawa soro chagi res o dindisung na yor.
So for example, in Maitreya's Abhisammayalankara, the ornament for realizations, in the homage, Maitreya pays homage to the three super knowledges by extolling or talking about their virtues or their qualities. And so by speaking of the qualities of these three super knowledges, then he pays homage to them. In the commentary to the Ornament of Realizations by Acharya Haribhadra, In his text, he says, the purpose of speaking of these three super knowledges is for one to generate appreciation for them. Because when you have appreciation for them and then you start desiring them and you wish for them, then that wish and that appreciation for them becomes the cause for all your future positive attainments.
So that the legwa tamju to be good zawa indan kharis laba ina kensum la tawa kesona ani kensum dumdyo gi sambadi tawa gi tönye gi dumba cha yongures tönye gi dumba lesona ani kharishigrisna shung yongzo la töba jugures oda tönye gi dumba geje kensum gi tawa digi tönye gi dumba cha tönye gi dumba digi ani ngodo gi shung yongzo la da töba cheje 죽죽으래 töba cheba ina an töbe sheragi je samjung sherab ge an din gomjung sherab changche an dosi je korangi dibu kembasum tokba de gülli gege yo sonza ani kesonla tawa de leba tamju tu gü zawa yins odinde sonyor.
So how does this appreciation for these three realizations act as the cause for all future benefit? It says that if you have this appreciation, from this appreciation for them will arise the wish to attain them. So not just appreciation, but then the wish to have them or attain them oneself. And then through this wish to attain them, then one will engage in hearing or listening to that teaching. And from that wisdom of hearing, then will arise the wisdom of reflection or contemplation, which will then result in the wisdom of meditation. And so since all of these arise from an initial appreciation, the appreciation towards these three realizations, or these three, I think they're called super knowledges sometimes, is why or is how it acts as the cause for all future benefit.
So that debul tönye dumba geche ani töbal juba ina ani kang töba dugir da debul tönye mebache ani töba cheba ina kang töba di shigire dugi mare dende töba di ngazu namju shungi nalola namju ngazu lama komo tsogi töba tögyang se ta kanda digi ani ngazu shiju duye la ko sheda da pendo medebchi ka jizamgi töba cheru roba di sugi ko 다동 시규 뒤에기 sablo 시규 차로 줘서 그러지. 시 태방원에 다 슝니 송반나시 게 태바 천된데 제바 이나 아니 가주 야 라마 고마주 송나로 여반나시 퇴배 코랑기 아니 규톨레라 또 쇼직 뉴바 쇼진 퇴비 요소서 퇴비 규톨세제 송겨요래. 다 딘디기 미유디 터두기 미유 고바 텔러 믹세 아니 퇴바데 마제바 이나 다 퇴바 퇴장세데 심세 다 디기 아니 가주 심주되어 쇼쇼게 펜도다보다 쇼 미용해야지. 근데 괜찮지 아니야? 가시게 술사시기로 왔다. 퇴바 가지고 제바는 펜도스게면도 와서야 계좌들이 가지고 남길 레디기 요로.
The reason for this is because if you have the wish to attain something and then you engage in hearing about it and you have the desire and you desire something and then you hear about it, as a natural outcome of this combination of the wish to attain something and hearing about it, then leads quite naturally into the actions that are going to lead you to attain it or to actualize it. Whereas if you don't have any desire to attain it and you hear about it, you might know about it, but you will not have the wish to attain it, you will not have the wish to actualize it, and you will not engage in any activity to actualize this. And so what the masters of the past have called this kind of hearing, which is not accompanied with the wish to attain it, as mere, just kind of plain, ordinary, mere hearing. And this kind of hearing the teachings or the scriptures has no real impact on one's mind, on one's own continuum. Whereas if one listens with the intention or with the wish to attain what one is listening to, because it results in all the other qualities that arise from practicing and internalizing these things, certain masters of the past again have said that there is liberation upon hearing, just liberation upon hearing. So that is what it refers to when they talk about liberation upon hearing. If you don't have this kind of attitude and you listen to the teachings, far from actually wishing to attain them and being able to tame one's own mind, what often happens is that someone becomes kind of complacent, or one might even become arrogant. And so, because this is a quality that arises when someone is listening to the teachings without really being concerned of actualizing them or concerned about attaining what it is being taught, we get a little kind of dismissive and judgmental, and we kind of look down upon listening to the teachings, and we say, what's the point if you keep listening to hundreds of teachings? So this kind of belittling attitude that one develops towards listening to the teachings arises from not having understood how the listening has to be accompanied with the wish to attain what you're listening to.
So that dribble miche, pena dribble tarbadan karimigi na dribble miche. Ani töbachena, tini lama dizani givishinye dizani töbarere cheche. 아니 내가 레레레 신용도 샘기 딩나라 조민다고 믹스지게요. 디 tö바tö연 신예데라 디 조와들레요 말이. tö바tö연 신예디고 믹스 사와르 셰제 사와르 셰인데 셰제 사와르 지 셰송 삼바 디지마도 샘 딩니고 초민다고 슈지게디 요 말콜라. 다 수수기 디불 믹제 아니 디트현두니에 아니 터바 제윤디 라메자네 담가 사와르르르 냉가르르르 아니 퇴용디 셈디나로 수수기 고아당 셈디나로 초민도 도민도 게요.
If you listen to the teachings with the result in mind and with the wish to attain that result, then every new thing that one hears, or every new explanation or clarification that one hears, because it is kind of responding to a need, with each new thing that you hear and each new problem that gets solved and each new doubt that gets clarified, there is an equally strong resultant feeling of joy and satisfaction that one experiences. If someone is solely concerned with hearing the teachings and they don't particularly desire them, then even though you might learn new things and you might receive further teachings, you don't see a proportionate increase in how you feel about it or the joy that arises from listening to these teachings. And so, if you have the goal in mind and you're listening with the intention of attaining that goal, when a teacher or when a guru gives you instructions at each step that are giving you what you need in that particular moment, each instruction that you get, because it's something that you're thirsty for and that is necessary for you, and it gives you exactly what you need, you have a resultant joy and you experience it and you can feel the joy in further instructions.
다 소소기 디부지글 된도 녀제. 되니 tö바 제용도 라메자는 담가리리 퇴용도 초민다고 믹스리리 기기리 미시 초민다고리 깨바 디츠기 소소를 담가 지점 퇴바당 초민다고리 깨바 디츠기 기비신에 될라 셈딩니 미시베 대바직당 셈딩니 규버 숙체로 주고시다. 신이 된수기 똑바 신이 된수기 냠내도 숙체로 주고시. 다 지불 되게 매바체 지불 미과 매바체 퇴바 퇴양 시제 아니 기비신에 대해서 담가 싸워든지 소소기 시제 싸워 가지고 시에서나 아니 소소기 시제 싸워 시기 마로 줘요인데 아니 소소기 시제디 다 캠바디 체로 누구로 와 시제 시에별로디 숙체로 체로 줘요인데 되니 간점진에 기비신에 들랭아 시제 연된 차랑 알 하고 인세기 고 나게게 귤주스 다디 캐바좀 보시오요 다 지기 지점기 터바체로 줘 대유수기 라마들로 그바체로 줘야지다 대바체로 줘야지 지기디 대바충으로 줘야지다 나지체로 줘야지 아니 디 드웨이 캐바디 지기 드블 믹세 터바체바 송선 디기 캐벤드레 지기 드블 머미 버체제 터바 퇴장신 심바 송선 디기 디부 차되고 다디 캐바좀 빼요.
If with the wish to attain the result, you listen to a teaching or you listen to a teacher, so you rely on a spiritual guide and you receive instructions, because each instruction is clarifying something that you need to make progress, and with each clarification you make further progress and you realize something new and you understand something new, as your experience and your joy progressively grows, your faith and your admiration and your pride, equally, the faith and admiration and respect towards your teacher, towards your spiritual guide proportionately grows, and your pride continuously diminishes. If, on the other hand, you do not have the goal in mind and you're only listening to new things, then when your spiritual guide keeps giving you new information and new instructions, as you accumulate this kind of storehouse of information and instructions, there even comes a point when you feel like you know more than your spiritual guide, because you've accumulated this enormous quantity of information. And at that point, you might even start feeling like you know more than your teacher, more than your guru. And that leads to this kind of enormous pride. And so it's very important to notice this, because the same cause, which is receiving instructions and teachings based on one's underlying intention and purpose for being there, has two diametrically opposite results. In one case, it leads to an increase and a natural strengthening of faith and respect and closeness to your teacher, and a diminishing of your pride. And in the other case, it leads to you reducing, to a reduction in one's faith, admiration, and an increase in one's pride. And this is entirely based on whether one is doing this, one is engaging in hearing the teachings with an intention of attaining that result, or if one is merely hearing it for the sake of hearing it.
What did it? Tak under 가자는 아주 쉬디에들에 땅 아주 퇴버 체디 고 퇴버 촐라만 로시 간다 퇴버디 내를 심버시 아주 구구요로 봐 어디 구구요바 인디 아니 지불 미고디 구구레스 가장 아주 풍고 하마메베 꼭발을 미고시 구구레스다 마타임바 미유 딘디지 송 구구요다 타르바 세지 마타임바 타르바 미유를 송체 아니 퇴버 체투시 구구요리 다마슝 신이 대양 아니 라보스미 또 줄게 되지 되니 니준 상상 양들 또 줄게 되니지 마 슝마치 닝힌되게야 아니 딘데기 타르발을 미체 아니 니준 상상 양들 또 튼둥이에도 퇴바체징이 심바이나 다 상계기 땜바 또 뷰다고 슈징기였다 다디 차진디 게겐다 기루니가 고도와 소서 다디 차진지 야고 딘디 차진데 상바이나 단다지 파발라게 아야데웨기 시geb이 나로라 아니 계획신이 신이 상와다 로마 신이 상와 상송 니디 냠도 좀소나 딘 코로바데라 타요레 송레 디니 계획신이 신이 마상마체 로마양 로미 신이 따다 마상마체 딘디지기 드고는 퇴바체바이나 다디기 코로발리 트로발리 시라키 펜도 연구메 오선자 디 코알라니 타 메바드레스 어딘디 송요.
So that's why from the beginning we've been saying that if you're listening to the teachings, the motivation with which you listen to the teachings is having a clear goal in mind. And the goal is what we've been saying from the beginning, which is attaining the cessation, liberation. And so when this is the goal and you are engaging in teaching after having actualized and after possessing these realizations, and when there is a student who wishes to listen to the teachings because they have this goal in mind and they wish to attain this goal, when these two things come together, when these two conditions are met, then in that moment the teachings of the Buddha, the scriptural teachings of the Buddha are being upheld and they are being passed on. And so as you can see, this relies both on the teacher and the student. That's why Acharya Aryadeva, he says that when a perfect teacher that possesses all of these qualities and a perfect student that possesses these qualities, they come together, then there is an end to samsara. Whereas if the teacher is lacking in some qualities or the student is lacking in some qualities, even though they may come together and there may be transmission of knowledge and someone might be even listening to it, because it is not fulfilling the criteria required for it to lead to realization, there is no end to samsara if two such people come together.
Oh yeah, that's what
Ale. Tanda dirish. Tanda nga zu thalo tsokden dambo chik tsa dhugurwa gala. Ta tsokden dambo di tsa du mi kashi ki susu lungpa la lo dhoya ta ani paa dhune lega che susu sanda nyamdu de. Yang kashi ki dewa de ne tanda nangchu mutu ne jaya ki dhoba. Ani kashi ki sara la chi ne pyohi jaya ki dhoba chik le digi dos tsam dewa chik la le yungu dos. Ta tanda gen la kadin shuwe di ta nga zu jema dewa tsa ne kawa dro ma dro tha chea la ta nga zu riglam jhaan shagyu digi chik pensa re pensa ma res. Karjini shubha ina ta tanda digi len tse yondu len di len yanda ba yin mi kazus mo kazus samlo ta na di len tata chi gyama tu me la de yus. Di karjini tama tirish ani yang kyushik to
Ale. 다 강도 탄다 계란수 대 로전 씨가 팽에서 자마디 소륜디 차제 다 산에 가와도지 패버 이너다 가와도지 다 소소 레네 간데지라 봐 슈칭기 연날에 산에 가와지를 침바 이너에 다 뒤균드네 삼모 코고야디 뒤균드네 삼모 코고야디 깨가나시기 둥에 나위 둥에 가위 둥에 치위 둥에 세 띵가서 되고 말와다 다디 되게 매바 인디 디 깨왈렘바 디기 용대버지 아니 깨와 딜 마타르베 링텔라 코 둥에 디 무드니도 용고고 여바 손산 깨왈을 두고고 세기 레드 녀몽 다 샤완도 송지도 스케디야디 디기메 세시 나간다 가장 아주 슈브나시 풍부 둥에게 라신도 통고래 세저로 봐 띵아주 카드이나 가와 침바이나 세마나라 띵아주 태양국이었다 제삼기 풍부도 둥에이 바 셰바 대추기 풍부 유녀몽라 아주 다통거 풍부딜라 둥에도 마통바이나 풍부 링킹이 유라 간데스니주 통도 풍부 링킹이 유딜라 아주 간데스네 되니 녀바 통도 통토예요 말 송자다 강 미드비 둥에 아주 짬이셔 쇼주 여러다 용디기도 봐. 어디 사자 딘디기 풍부 렘바디기 깨와 렘바디기 용기 여바다. 되니 깨비 규디 녀몽 레더 녀몽 디나니 장 녀몽 세디. 디 삼로 푹들 샤바이나 아니 그 뒤균디는 세만 나로라 그 녀몽 까마투베이나 녀몽기 샤왕도 송디고 어디네 녀몽을 다통으로도 여바인데 혹한다 녀몽을 수행체대지 용구로 봐. 녀몽을 껴통대 용구로 보다. 딩아주 구구여 봐. 소소다디 구구여 봐인데 아니 녀몽을 껴통 녀몽을 다통 딘데기 로지 코균데니 여대버지 여번이나 아니 녀몽기 녀보디 다 녀몽기 녀보고면 연하면디 미다보 고미야 동예보 고미야 똥보 고미야 담에 고미야디 임버인데 안 디딩아주 리글람디다 표시 용구로 봐. 디딩아주 리글람디 표시 용구로 봐. 다 미다보 곰고로 봐. 둥이 곰고로 똥 담에 곰고로 봐. 곰고도 아니 리글람디 표시 제고로 봐. 다 디디 리글람디 표시 제 용구로 봐. 손상 녀몽도 탑이야기 삼로지 매버이나 녀몽도 탑기 말해. 녀몽도 마탐는 녀몽이 녀부 줄때 깨제 고랍니다 봐. 손상 녀몽을다 다르통체 녀몽을 탑이야기 삼로지 여버이나 아니 녀몽도 녀몽이 녀부때야기 삼로지 리기래. 녀부때 연디 녀부디 당기 라오나시 친지말로 따와지고는 녀몽을 녀부때야디 또 녀부 초도 주고 들어와. 디 참아 안 가지고 리글람디 표시 다 리글람 표시래도 소다 냠랭갈 표시래도 디가도 들어다.
대치부에서 말하는 리글람 표시다는 다 체야라 간데 타수 가와도마도 대치티오나 디치
가와도마도세나
데워차네 소소기 랑과 카레 담마담라 리글람 표시다는 랑카 담야지 용사리 용사마리
단다 쉬어 들어봐.
어떤 디드롭 차네 땅아 데워 조고이
사제딜에
사제 티오든지 인자 저도
알레 다 리글람 표시제 nga 사제가 도르스 딩이 하면고다.
So the question is, after the first module of this program, many of us go back home and back to a job, relationships, etc. Also, some of us are considering to leave that behind in order to be able to study more Dharma or Tibetan at Sara College. My question is, how can one use reasoning and logic in this process of deciding what specific path to choose for oneself? It seems that certain questions do not have an objectively correct answer, and then I find it more difficult to use reasoning in order to arrive to a conclusion. And so, irrespective of where one goes when this is over, whether one goes home or goes elsewhere, the one thing to always keep in mind and always remember and constantly, repeatedly reflect on is to reflect on the suffering or the unpleasantness that arises from birth, aging, and sickness and death. Because these four things are not anything that one desires. Especially with aging, sickness, and death, since that's not something one desires, getting familiar with it to a point where one really gets fed up and one wishes to completely get rid of them is helpful, because then it leads you to understand that as long as one takes birth, these other four will naturally arise. And so if one is able to reflect on this again and again repeatedly, then one has this recollection that as long as there is birth, this state is going to continually perpetuate itself. When one can understand this, then it helps to further generate the wish to remove this birth after having after that looking for what the causes of this birth are. And then when one realizes further, if one can trace it back to understanding that this comes from karma and afflictions, then one generates a strong wish to be freed from karma and afflictions. To do all of this, if one is not able to identify one's own aggregates as a source of suffering, then one will not be able to see the afflictions, which are the cause of these aggregates, as one's enemy or something that one needs to do away with. If one is not able to see the aggregates as one's enemy or something that is keeping one stuck and trapped in a state of perpetual suffering, as a base for one's suffering, then it's not possible to view the afflictions or to see attachment and ignorance and all the other afflictions as something that is detrimental to our well-being. If, however, one is able to see this in the way that we have just mentioned, then it becomes very evident that amongst karma and afflictions, it is afflictions which are the main enemy. And then when one recognizes that, even if one is not able to completely remove them or do away with it right away, the repetitive or the repeated familiarization and understanding that one generates through this reflection makes one feel very uncomfortable with having the afflictions. And through this discomfort and dissatisfaction with having to live or coexist with this mind that is constantly afflicted, that will lead very naturally to trying to find a way to overcome the afflictions and find an antidote to the afflictions. And at the point where one is trying to find an antidote to these afflictions, it's at that point when reasoning becomes relevant and important. Because at that point when you're trying to meditate or cultivate an antidote to the afflictions, after you have seen this entire causal process, then at that point, the only way that you can really do anything about removing or countering these afflictions is generating an antidote, which necessarily needs reasoning and logic, which is what we are developing over here. And so the logic and the reasoning and the way of reasoning that we're studying here later on, it is only going to be relevant if you have a wish to attain liberation and you have identified what's holding you back. And so in the practice of developing an antidote, it is helpful. As far as the utility of reasoning and logic in the process of deciding what exact path to do after one is finished from here, I don't really have an answer for that.
But Zambling and the Saja Kawal Chimba machine Saja Jemidua, Saja Kawachiman is the Shin Rogudua. Ta Kederda. Kedi Zambling Nalon is Saja Jigda, Saja Kawaii and Saja D. Saja de Levena, and Shigio Maris Laji, Saja Juna, Karjisarganzo.
So, wherever one decides to go on this planet, wherever it might be, wherever one goes, if one decides to go there and kind of move there and stay there, it still is a place where one is going to go and one has to die. Were there on earth a place or a country, somewhere where one could go to, which would guarantee that one would no longer die, what would one what would one's kind of choice or what would one's direction be? How would one choose?
So that chiwa maybe sajuji yoris labayina, saja zamling saja dinji yoris. Diana jingi de saja diles naya yomaris sayar. Yemen lumba di kala de sevina, gengo chaya yomaris labayina. 나와 되고면 가와 되고 뭐 치와 되고면서 상가 얘기를 한 건조다. 딱 상가 탭기로 어디. 소자다 간주 단단 남부상기 뜨르는 가르쳐서나 어디 치와메비 고방지 두세 거다. 치와메비 고방지 간주 될라다 소소 드로만도지 마도 딘데지 두세 거다. 잠블링 디나 두세 거 말데 간다 치와메비 고방지 운도체 두세 거다.
So if this place could further guarantee that one would not fall sick, and it would also further guarantee that if you ate the food in this place you would not get old, because none of us want to get sick, none of us want to get old, and none of us want to die, there would be like a huge line. Everyone would be really struggling. There would be like a lot of demand to get over there. But what we're saying over here is, even though it might not be a physical location where one can go and get this, there is a state. What is being said is there is a state where one can overcome all of these things. Now this state is being presented and it's being said and it says it exists. Now whether one decides to go there or not is entirely in one's own hand. But there is a state where one can be freed from birth, aging, sickness and death.
So that tarba se geje sheyunde tarba shingen soge ma tarba ma songyunde disegorada tada korwale diganzo 풍부들 shegoroda. 소자 나와 치와 가와 덴데 용딩이 풍부디 코로와인디 타르바슬레디 나와메데바 치와메데바 데니 가와메데바 덴데기 풍부지 두스 풍부지 주베 두스 이거다 다 덴데 깨져지 튀어봐이나 오니시는 가서 텔라랑지 따디 오미네슬레 연나면은 간 깨져 덴데 튀어왔삼게 아띠 간데레스다 등이랑 심에 올래 궁에도 오지 요르단 가서 오니시야봐이나.
So when those who do speak of liberation of samsara and those who speak of nirvana, when they talk of liberation, they're talking about liberation from the aggregates. And when we're talking about the aggregates that are the nature of samsara, we're talking about aggregates that are conditioned into necessarily following the pattern of birth, aging, sickness and death. And so when we talk about liberation, when liberation is spoken of, you're talking about a liberation from an aggregate or from a state of birth, aging, sickness and death. So you're talking about taking on a state that is deathless, ageless, birthless and without disease. Now technically, if this is something that one hears, and that is exactly how it is explained, merely hearing this should kind of bring about some level of curiosity or some amount of perplexity by saying, my God, really, is there something like this? Is there something of this kind? There should genuinely be an interest or some fascination at least when one hears of a state such as this that is being presented as an alternative.
So the jumnende kyaganaji dungedido seche 다 상마 시구고 열베 상마 나구고 열에서 ngayen 시기르베 ngayen 나기르베 ngayen 경고 차기르베서 아니 고랑기 칼로와디 따당이 칼로와디게 어 샤지다 고랑 야부세로 야세 계란야 나기르스 차기르스 시기르스 디시기르스레디 다 나야메주 고반지도 치야메주 고반지 열에서 계제디 딘디지 열에서는 땀디 튀어요 말다 다 딜러디고나 다가랑기 셈나는 양얘기에제 아니 되는 침벌와 되는 친제 안절 장성주 토지 캐란데 가르치고 있어요 아니 거기 공개하고 가르치서 지원에 고반도 벌써 근데 지원에 고반 퇴운도 고난에 셈는 가와 쉬우지게지 지원에 고반지 연나 다 딜라 가르고 그랬어야지 아니 배 차선례 당시더니 침벌와 어디다.
So even in the story of the Buddha's life, the Buddha, when he was a prince and he left the palace with the chariot, he saw old age, he saw sickness, he saw death, and being overwhelmed by the sight of these things, and upon asking whether the Buddha himself, at that point he was Prince Siddhartha, when he asked if he too would have to go through this, is this also his fate? The charioteer, at that point, he looked at the Buddha and he said, yes, Prince, this is also something that you have to endure. And at that point, the Buddha, or Prince Siddhartha, still hadn't even heard that there was a state that is deathless, without age, without any disease. And even though he didn't hear that, the fact that he heard that he has to undergo these kind of, this is his destiny, he was so overwhelmed and he was so unhappy by this that he left. And then when he was so overwhelmed by this, then the next time he saw an ascetic who was practicing, and then he went to the ascetic and he asked him, what is it that you're doing? And the ascetic replied, I'm trying to actualize a state of no death, or to actualize the deathless state. When the Buddha only heard, when Prince Siddhartha heard that there is such a thing as a state that is free of death, or a deathless state, this brought about enormous joy in him, just hearing about this.
Nge namje ta nangbala thangbo saba shooting su nangba nangbe chula da thon tönye le ding thangbo su cheba ina konzola tebo chimbi chyo kordi shegme mangchewa da thanda phungbu dungi gi zawa yimba che ni phungbu mebe kokwa dikyang she de korba so so da nge tanda gyaga jir gya da nge thobo do re deduce lana digmendo so so koran la 다 풍부 등에 시행인데 어디 레도스 거랑 하고도스 다 가르쳐 버렸어. 그래서 코로딜레도 다 풍부디 매버서야지 풍부디 레메고 와시지 아니 나의 사주메 이거 풍부 샴발 내야요스라로 코드지도 가다셔다. 덴바시 디시에니 풍부 상황에 고고 시에지 딜레인데 풍부 싸워지 두그레스 딘 레닝이 시행하지 많이 풍부지 딜라 나의 차이요 마르세 다 코디 고도스지 배 So
I have an Indian friend, and generally whenever I speak to anyone who is kind of interested in the Dharma, or are beginners who are being introduced to the Dharma, I never really talk very much about Mahayana, the Mahayana aspect of the teachings of the Buddha. Instead, I try and communicate and share the fact that the aggregates, these aggregates that we have the nature of aging, of getting sick, and of dying. And getting familiar with this and understanding this, and then understanding that because they arise from birth and this birth can be brought to an end, there is a state that can be actualized where one takes on a new set of aggregates that are very different from these, that are not conditioned by birth, aging, sickness and death. And so this friend of mine, when I was telling this to him, he looked at me and he said, well, I know that my aggregates are like this, I know that that's what it is, but what do you want me, like what does one do? And then when I told him, there is a state where you can remove these aggregates which are conditioned in this manner, from the bottom of his heart, he was thrilled, he was overjoyed at hearing this. And he said, I want this, I really, really want this. It just kind of came naturally to him.
So that the lo tangbo to called denshi she, ta ko denshi nyamni chigore. Ta lo jema de yangja to ngani. Yangja to che. Ta ko denshi nyamni koran denshi nyamni khari chigi me koran ya doje ya ma doje she de shi. Ni ma ji gonda khalase ngani chamjam she ro wok chimur. An ko ngala hopkala. 디 베베게 상계기 쳐디 나올라 상하고도 쇼지 송고도 디 가르랬어. 단들이 가신들에서 그디 계지시 그런가. 디시데 아니게 상계기 수분이다. 단기 깨가는 지금 눈에면 풍부 딜레 사고 다동 상계기 수기 풍부가 연대 가리면 수분도 거지 셰로. 당아디 두고 있어. 딜레로 두에만 디두발 담은 왕쇼고서라. 날 두방트로서 그 어디를 랑심이 거를 So
the same person, this friend of mine, he spent about a year reflecting on and meditating on the Four Truths, which is the primary material which talks about how the aggregates are the nature of suffering and how one can attain liberation from them. And so after having done this, we met again about a year later, And then we were speaking, and he was asking me whatever observations or whatever kind of experiences he had. And then when in the evening we ate and we were going out for a walk, he asked me, he said, there's this thing that is very popular amongst the Tibetan Buddhists, which is this whole tantric principle or concept. So what is it all about? And then when I told him how the aggregate, or like maybe not the aggregate, but the body of the Buddha is something that is even further superior to a state or the aggregates that one attains when one attains liberation from the afflicted aggregates. There is something that is even better or even superior and further than that, which is the body of the Buddha that you can take. As soon as he heard this, he said, okay, I want that. How do you get that? And I told him, that's not very easy. For this, you need to first take initiation. And instantly, but very naturally, he said, please give me initiation.
손상당 동행이 남랑디 뒤균들이 가서 단계 시작은 하시 동행 거도 샘규는 공부도 셔야 되버이나 풍부 상황이 고고 세디 땀 거와다 다디 탑람도 두분다 아장장 풍부 상황이 고고 열에서 땀 거와서 샘는 거하게 되지 그 용해요 어디다.
If one therefore is well familiar or is well familiarized with what it means to have the nature of suffering, what it means that the aggregates are the nature of suffering, and one has gained sufficient familiarity with it, and one has a good understanding of it, merely hearing about a state that is free from such contaminated and afflicted aggregates, without even having to hear about the possibility of a path. Of course, if one heard about the path and all the way in which it can be attained, but just hearing that such a state is possible technically should bring about enormous joy when one hears that such a thing is possible.
또 대하나신 로주 심바지 시에베 인다. 지즈밀레르 키랑스 또 망제와 싱그르와. 소도 지즈밀레 당보 투게지 미망고 쫑제. 아니 디젤라다 코나 제젤라 코랑다 라마 텐데서 지여와. 디게드네 라마 디존의 렌디기 남샤는 조직 퇴용데. 나코는 렌디기 남샤디 퇴용데 딱코 미tom나 디세바 손자 냐마도 조사메베 셈나 감라시 부치게로다. 땡예웨기 둥에도 조직시 레디 규카리미 레기 남샤는 조직 마송체 근데 레디 따다 코랑게 룹사로 사사버와 소자 감라시 이게 용데 근데 라마직 땡제 따디 냐왈 깨먹고 서야 열었어도 쇼가기도 지즘밀라 텔라마디 샤바 또지 뱃거라 다 세디로 세디 코로나 그냥 냐왈 깨먹고 세디 코로나 초워트베든데 열었라니 계제시 지즘밀라 셈 딩닝 뱃거라 가르서고는 가와께지 디도와 어디 디도버다.
So you're all surely familiar with Jitsu Milarepa, who was this very well-known personality. Jitsun Mila, in an earlier part of his life, through black magic or whatever else, he had killed an entire village of thousands of people. And later, when he met a teacher who explained to him how karma works and how non-virtuous actions lead to lower rebirths in the hell realms, just hearing this and having realized that Jitsumila himself had accumulated all of these actions brought about such enormous fear in him that he kind of just requested desperately, said, is there any way that I can ensure I'm not born in the hells? At which point then the teacher said, yes, I have a teaching or I have a means where you can attain a state in this life itself where not only you will not be born in the hell realms, but you can attain liberation in this life. And because of that desperation that Jitsumila had, just hearing that this was possible, he brought him enormous joy. And he felt motivated and driven to do it.
다 디나시 다 타르바토벨은 규릉부 고르기르바 다 타르바토벨의 규릉부 고르기레 다 디바로를 깨어먹고 랭고르바 서 깨어먹고 랭고 되간라 다 깨와 야갈 렌사요다 디바로라 깨어먹고 깨와직 렌이 랭고요레 코와를 타리고 마타비 링델다 코와나를 찌고 요바 인디 아니 마타비 링델라 다 지기 둥에 용아 되니 체ring와 되니 최지의 개와 망아 되니 개외신이 잼고 그 개외신이 코라 계점니는 바게를 개외신이는 체도야 된대기 개와 된대 내야였다 그 상기비 숭기였다 다 된대들라 배나 상기기 신감된데 배나 대화진기 신감스 된대 숭기요래 다 대화진기 신감돼서 맞아 탈바마도 이 버르들 깨요 맞아 개와들 내요 땅원에 거는 끼비 등에 나비 등에 삼로 코딩에 다 치말랑원에 타버 세딜 타버 두마돈 빼사송 삼 치말라 타돈 된데 두마토나 대외년 빼사송 세 삼무된데 여바이나 된디지 여레스 라인데 야 셈나 가와시기도
When one has the aim of attaining liberation, since attaining liberation itself is not something that is immediate or is attainable right away, and one needs to therefore naturally go through different births, because births have to happen. That's not something that one can control. And because one has to go through a series of different births until one can attain this state of liberation. In the meantime, so in these interim births, there are certain births that are considered conducive to continuing the practice of Dharma. And so they are births that are characterized by being a favorable birth, where one has endowed with all the capacities, where one is in touch with the Dharma, and where one doesn't have to strive enormously to come in contact with spiritual guides who can lead one, but from the very beginning, one has the fortune to be in touch with perfect spiritual teachers. So such births, if one can attain such a birth in the meanwhile or along the way, that makes it favorable to continue practicing the Dharma, to that get closer always to attain liberation. Then when one knows of this and one has heard of liberation, then hearing that there is this option as well, again should naturally bring about great joy. And so such births are known as being born in the pure realm, such as the realm of pure joy. And so there's all these pure realms that one can take birth in the meantime. And then in the teachings of the Buddha, there are these methods that have been taught of how one can attain or be born in these pure lands.
디니네 튀어지 소소 랑네 레가라 슈고치마이나 디그레 야 비장가 두고이나 딱 가왈 두고요 마이나다 다셈 수르데나라 풍부 동에 임바디 야고 공부시 아니 리글람 장교도 표지시 딱 계제 풍부 동에 딘데 짐바이나 아니 풍부디 매바 차이 풍부디 규디 녀모르 세기도 녀몬데니 친줄로 땡데르 세기도 안 친줄로 땡데바인데 친줄로디 콜로 양다바시케바이나 코 세야 요르세기도 다디 요바이나 안키 다돈딜 튜니기 드마마게와디 가르치니스 릴람기 소소랑 까르든 디고르다 가와치만 디까르든 디고르다.
So when you leave from here, irrespective of where you go, whether you go back to your own countries or you go to Sara to study Tibetan or you stay here, whatever it might be, on one side of your mind, always keep this interest in trying to understand or reflect on the fact that the aggregates are the nature of suffering. And if you can understand this, then use your reasoning that you have learned to consider the fact that the teachings say that these aggregates are the nature of suffering. So you check that. Then the teachings also say that these aggregates are produced by or they arise from karma and afflictions. So you check that. Then you check that these teachings also say that the afflictions are mistaken states. And if it is a mistaken state, the teachings also say when you develop a correct realization or the wisdom that realizes that what the ignorance or this mistaken mind is engaging in doesn't exist, it's possible to remove these afflicted states. And so if all of this is true, then why am I still sitting here without the enthusiasm or the wish to attain it? And so you can keep using your reasoning that you've learned over here to continuously check each one of these aspects and ask yourself why you still don't feel inspired to attain this if all of this is possible. And so you can use your reasoning again and again, irrespective of where you are, to keep doing this.
다 랭령이 샤완진기 풍부 매바디 답베 대화를 세기도 안 딜을 되냐기 듬바 가르치는 메스 난 수수 따서 당나 tiwa khari legisana an danda lenyeng shang jing phungbu dungye gi zawa yimba dingang nglen che tu min dus ta ta ma du ngazo kelen che tu min dus sai de ligru ba lenyeng phungbu dungye gi zawa yimba kelen che tu min dus di legire yamena lenyeng phungbu sebe seba yo lenyeng phungbu sebe an gokba yo ba dinga yi chi gi min dus 다 디니 가나 레기로보다 가르친 되니 책임에서 되니 미지 투사 가와 투순스잖아 소소 지와 땅에 있나.
And then when you ask yourself that here we've heard, or in the teachings the Buddha has mentioned that there is a state of liberation from these afflicted aggregates, then you ask yourself, why is it that if the state is being mentioned again and again, I'm not even inspired to attain it? What's preventing me from wishing to attain it? And as an answer to this question, you'll find that either you will not agree that the aggregates that one has are currently the nature of suffering. So either we're not going to agree with the fact that our aggregates are a source of our suffering. That's one place where we'll get stuck. Or another place where one potentially gets stuck in saying, even if that is the case, I cannot come to accept that there is a state where I can completely eradicate these aggregates and I can attain a state like this. So when you check and you ask yourself where you're getting stuck, where I'm getting stuck in not being able to generate enthusiasm or the wish to attain the cessation that is being spoken of in the texts, and you analyze and you check and you reason with yourself, you use your reasoning to check within yourself, you probably find that it's going to be one of these two.
단단 알아서 소설 렌데 주 풍부디 나외 동에 가외 동에 사외 동에 장외 동에 상막이 땐 지금 민두슬라는 간데 액셉션 제토야 걸면 되고 용의 춥디도 와.
And then looking at one's own aggregates to say that these are not the source of aging, suffering, death, pain, unpleasantness, discomfort. Trying to say that that's not the case or disagreeing with this is kind of difficult to do because you can just experience it. It's not something that requires any further evidence.
So 다디 단다 미드비 등에 탐지기 땐 치디게 풍부디 땐 치기요 단다 풍부디 땐 치기요 아주 용의 죽기도 봐. 다디 용의 죽기 요바이나 기 풍부디 가신 렘버레 세 지워지들래 보러 풍부 삼아메베 고과 든지 요 이치기 민두슬람나 다 고과 요 이 마치나야 다 지워들래 보러 풍부디 가르친 렘버 풍부디 랭이 그 가르래 디 메바 소에 연나면에서 셈나라 등해지들래 보러 가죠.
If one can identify these very aggregates right now as being the source or the base of all of this discomfort that we experience, which we know, it's not like it needs further proof and evidence, we know that. Leave aside for the time being that it's possible or there is a discussion about the state of liberation or cessation that is free from all the aggregates. Completely put that aside. Wouldn't one technically have to wonder, shouldn't one wonder, where did I get these from? Why am I stuck with these? Where are these coming from? And can I do anything about it? So this doubt also is something that one should technically have.
What a dirisha.
Tamarishage.
Tamardwe.
Do chik thangshage. Kashyapa senye. Do chiyo sir. Do dinalo la. Bushing la. Aleho. Tanda lungya ne bushing dima tugro lage odila metsa gyapche metsik dodu me barwada bushing kurang tsik tugres odipe ko ne ta toni tobe logi yane ando gombe to kitela sherab ki ngo ki gire sherab di ngar gombe lod tsik tugres chene pedoni duksma jana shas o gengi dikola tesuna Technologic suna disservice thana. Tat thiwa dirisha thana. Jebat sema Quran, jebat sema tsame tayagi.
당한서 단기 직 디슈고 단기 참조될 단기 하대 직도. 손자 풍부 등의 탐지 댄셔버디 가서 사무도 스타나 하고 투구스다. 디 하고반의 라신이 되니 풍부디 가르친 랜에서 뒤와 단기 레든 상 리기르다. 레 공예도 지고 라신도 레고. 땅아조 가셔서 뒷바루들라 사제기 초가 대화만 고시 명예라 고갑라고 걸어봐. 뒷 용용도 아주 제루거다. 풍부디 둥이 땡이 바디 아주 제신제. 양 김난도 샤지 디 사제기 소원 대화들 셈이 행체 그래서 디 인도 아니 아주 동양 곰슬라이드 동양 곰슬라도 간다 동양 용이 계제 members 동양 코란가를 미고 샤지 아주 곰 야고에 nen가였다 제모 맞이해도 고 인지 민지 곰 고고였다.
Before moving on to the next one, there was this one connection that's important to make before closing that previous argument, and that is that the fact that our aggregates, that our body and mind right now are a cause or are the base for us experiencing suffering is quite evident. And when one thinks or when one recognizes that this is the state that we have, very naturally the questions about why is it like that, why does it have to be like that, where does this come from, is there any way to get out of it, are very naturally ensuing from this original reflection or this realization. What does happen in certain moments, however, is that we have certain feelings or sensations of pleasurable sensations that arise in between. And these pleasurable sensations are contaminated pleasurable sensations and feelings, but they're still pleasurable. So when in the interim between our reflection and everyday life, we have these moments of pleasure, this pleasure makes us forget or not remember, not recall the fact that our aggregates actually are still a base of suffering. They still remain that. And because this distraction arises or we get kind of sidetracked by these pleasurable sensations, that's why it is said that one should reflect on the nature of suffering. And so reflecting on the nature of suffering or meditating on suffering is to gain repeated familiarity with the fact that our aggregates are of the nature of suffering, so that then when they have these moments of bliss or pleasure, one doesn't get sidetracked.
So 당 아주도 사제기 소와 대원 영어지 템바 남ing 쇼지 템바 제르디 양 풍보 고런 수카 타시 양 풍보가 나용데 코랑 수가 가줄 다디기서로 시도하다 디 등이 때레다서 수 다디기서 고 나온도 나용데 고 가줄 고모고 수 다디고라다 so 디인데 다 나용데 다 풍보디 누구 당기도 세제 고 깽이 쇼고랑 가죠 소자단 now 서로와디 마중게 바도 nga저 템바제 코디 템바제 소라오시지 디멤바체네고 코 윤데네 코 풍부디 둥이 땡 세지 셈 딩나르 디 샤데바이나 랑싱기 풍부림비 규 안 텔라 랑싱기 규엔다야 아니 데토 텔레톨레기 삼로디 코 윤데네 코로 로로두야 깨디야지 코 용구로 받고.
And in states when one is distracted or is kind of blissed out or having a really good time and is experiencing this contaminated but well-being, then when our body hurts or something hurts again, then it's like a reminder saying, actually, I still am the base of suffering. But until that reminder, one gets completely sidetracked or distracted and is in a different state the whole time. When one is then reminded of this, then one again very naturally says, oh, my aggregates again, my body is a source of my suffering, like that. But if one can not have to get distracted and sustain that realization or sustain that understanding of the body and our mind and our aggregates being a source or a base for the experience of suffering, and that can be a sustained realization, a sustained experience, then naturally and very effortlessly the wish to identify where it comes from, why is it like this, is there anything I can do about it, these are thoughts that very naturally arise from this constant realization or constant awareness of the fact that our aggregates are actually a base of suffering.
So the nangbe shungi nalola dunya comment pekesh mo sungu orta 소소 최냠년 챙겨지라 로 최로 도에라 동해 마공바 로 최로 로사 콘 메르타 되니 바르도 최 람도 송야라 동해 마공바 로사 메르타 시점기 당보 동해 공바디 로 최로 주에 당보 유치기래 바르도 동해 임바디 야네 안도 삼모땅 데바이나 최 타르친야기 유치기래 바르도 최 주비운도 갈라 최 람도 송야기 고 유치기래 타마 최 타르친베 고 유치기래 그 동요 공부도 토다 발음도 공부고요. 다이 닝지게고 대양 심진의 동요 공부다. 다양 심진 동예기 나대와대야 다다디 다데 동예기 동에서 많이 뭐 규로 동에서 많이 뭐 캬바도지 동에 어디에 세주고 검내더니 닝지게제 드니 닝지대야 토다 발음도 당보 남기 당보 chanju기 셈기 규제 바로 남 탑신 열로베기 규제 타만 디부 아니 조베상기 시공도 시에기 규제 그 토다 발음도 개천 보시기도 소소다 닝지 고면도 또 심징 동에 삼 빠에 들어왔다 어디 인도가나 그 동에 고메디 개천 시라래 동에 고메디 제침바이나 동에 마곰나 동에 제루다 동에 이버디 제루 동에 이버디 제소나 아니 가도 나와 기비 샤대 돼 가도 취 제루 다 돼래 취 제루 아니 가져 퇴샤바는 퇴되고 셔라 디메주 차도다 니베메주 차도 그러죠 어디다
When there is this realization of the fact that the aggregates are the nature of suffering, then that acts as the first cause to kind of steer our life onto the path of the Dharma. And then when one is practicing on the path, what ensures that our practice reaches its end or actualizes its goal is a repeated familiarization with the fact that our aggregates are the nature of suffering. Similarly, when one wishes to develop loving kindness is a mind or a state that is aware of the suffering of others. So even in that case, there is a meditation and a reflection and an understanding awareness of suffering. And then when that suffering acts as a cause to generate loving kindness, that loving kindness then becomes a cause of bodhicitta, and that loving kindness becomes the mind that sustains the practice on the path to attain Buddhahood by ensuring that one accumulates merit and wisdom. And then that loving kindness also at the end, when one attains Buddhahood, acts as the drive to benefit sentient beings. So loving kindness is important in the beginning, in the middle, in the end. Similarly, the reflection of the nature of suffering or the truth of suffering is important in the beginning, in the middle, and the end for oneself. And then when one wants to practice loving kindness and generate loving kindness, it is still a reflection of the truth of suffering on others. And then that is important in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end of the practice to attain Buddhahood. So the realization of the truth of suffering has always been considered extremely important and fundamental in any kind of Buddhist practice. Because when there is an understanding that this is the nature of suffering, all of these results arise. If one forgets that this is the nature of suffering and one forgets to identify one's aggregates as the nature of suffering, or one gets distracted from it, then in that moment everything looks very good, everything appears very pleasant, and then one completely forgets that this is the nature of suffering. And when that distraction arises, then that's the space from which one forgets to practice the Dharma, from which one forgets the Dharma. And if from that place and in that state one is listening to the teachings, then whatever one listens to has no effect, it has no impact on what one is doing.
Dirwa? Jebat sama
Me bushing la bhai ondu bushing me bushing jebat sama la tene
ta dire ngazu shungi nanglo la nyemong gi tene ta ngogi nyembo slugire nyemong pha ta meba sogen gi ngogi nyembo di tongyu musum do be ishire ta tongyu musum do be ishite la ngazu shungi nanglo la tanye garu so mido be ishi 송기요 다 미도 be ishi 송기요 바인디 디기 규 가르세디 다 델라 쯧바 총다 델 쯧바 총제 다 미도 be 규 델라 미도 바지 구그르 마도 넘버 똑바기 미도 be 규치 두고 말했어 디인디 아니 남도 빵거레스니 되행기 직직 총바래 다 케바 셴바지 디기 디셔가지 오스나 되니 미도비 귤은 남도 넘버 똑바기 미도이시 규치기랬다. 빼나 동유도비 제바디. 돈이 도비 잡아디 고 똑바래 나버 똑바래데 돈이 무슨도 도배 미도비 시디기 그 규칙이래서 다 디기 빼들 한다 도이 롱디 장기여 봐 싱틸레 매 바바이나 싱리기베 메디기 고 싱파 세버세버나시 아니 돈이 도디기 잡아세마디 코론 인규 넘버 똑바래 레데 넘버 똑바 고 텔레 게데 경기 돈이 도디기 이시디기 넘버 똑바 고디 파세체 미도 이시기 올파 줄기레스 어디니 빼된 자지 아주 중요한 송데 딜렌디.
So there's this other question which says, in the Kashyapa chapter sutra it says, Kashyapa, it is this way. For example, fire arises when the wind rubs two branches together. Once the fire has arisen, the two branches are burnt. Just so, Kashyapa, if you have the correct analytic intellect, a superior faculty of wisdom is generated. Through its generation, the correct analytical intellect is consumed. This is quoted in Purdue's book on debate to illustrate how through inferential cognition one advances to a point where inferential cognition itself is surpassed. Could you please elaborate on the meaning of the quote? Is it correct to see inference then as the cause for its own end? That's the question. So when we talk about the antidote to the afflictions, when we talk about a direct antidote to the afflictions, the direct antidote, which is really harming the afflictions or the mistaken minds, is known as a direct realization of emptiness. And this direct realization is also often called a non-conceptual realization of emptiness. When one then wonders what the cause of this non-conceptual realization of emptiness is, this has led to a debate in Tibet. And the first position said, since non-conceptual realization of emptiness itself is a non-conceptual state, the cause for this conceptual state, for this state which is non-conceptual, itself also has to be a non-conceptual state. And therefore, the practice or the cause to generate this non-conceptual realization of emptiness has to be a mind that is abandoning conceptual states. So it's the abandonment of conceptual minds. That's one position. The other position says that conceptual minds can act as a cause for a non-conceptual realization of emptiness. And that conceptual mind that acts as a cause for this non-conceptual state is an inferential cognizer, or an inferential in understanding of emptiness, which itself is conceptual. But by the repeated practice and cultivation of this inferential cognition, it will get transformed into a non-conceptual realization. And to support this view, or to support this position that a conceptual realization or an inferential understanding can transform or become a direct realization of emptiness, that's when this sutra is quoted in support of that.
Tatene 당아주 디여봐 신가지 나로라 다 사신지 나로라 아니 사변답 다 내사 아니 출류스 가지고 남주 빼샤대죠 내서 출류세지 사제 안디가라 사변체 안디가라 출루 아니 류루 다디 상마 창송바이나 아니 사변이 누구께 규진지 창침 버봐 사변이 누구께 규진지 창침시 다 사변이 누구께 규진 창바인데 텐디기 규진 창외 아니 사변텔라 바로도 개개인도 맞춰봐이나 아니 텔리 누구 중에 다 쳐버다 이나 양코 디바로라 개개인 체시 버다 개개인이 객시 버드래 걔디 개개인도 맞히나 텔레 아니 누구 중에 다 쳐신 거래 다 디낭로라 사변데 매바이나 아니 추류 셴바 가리 소바 이나르다 가리 소바 이나야 되니 누구 중에 더 미시바로지 다디 가서 하고 그러와 sa da chu lu sangma yoba che ina dinala sabyon di mena.
So, if you take a field, or you take a farm, a field, where you have a complete collection of all the causes that are required to lead to a harvest, where you have the seed, you have water, you have fertilizer, you have heat. When all of these things come together, when we have a collection, a complete collection of substantial causes and cooperative conditions, then that seed that is in that field, if it doesn't encounter any obstacles over time, then there is a guarantee that that seed is going to give rise to its effect. So the harvest will necessarily come. However, one cannot guarantee that along the way, in that time period between the seed and the harvest, there will be no obstacles. That's one. The other thing is, if one prepares a field perfectly with all of these conditions that are required to produce a sprout, but one doesn't plant a seed in it, then however much one might continue to further increase or better these conditions that support the growth of a seed, without the actual presence of a seed, we know for a fact that there is no chance that the harvest will ever arise from that field.
다 dinala sabyon di meba che shimba chasang tsang che ina yang nyugu ke gyu zo di sabyon che sabyon di meba che an dindi sabyon me di yin shing de la nyugu ke rewa gyab deba ina rewa tong ser ta.
Of all of the seeds that are required to produce the harvest, the most important one is the seed. Of all the causes to produce the harvest, the most important one is the seed. In a field which has all of the other causes but does not have a seed, if one places all of one's hopes and aspirations in this field giving rise to a harvest, those are empty hopes, those are empty wishes.
다 딘디기 사신 테라 sabyon meba che sa신 테라 뚠도지 nyuguji kena se semnala dumbake 아니 디케기 체도 되니 상계의 창조 sem바든으로 쏘았다 명랑게 제바이나 디나로다 뚠도 중앙 시기를 베스 라바이나 또 미시버다.
Then in that same field which has all of these perfect conditions but no seed, with this field in front of us, praying to the Buddhas and praying to all the Bodhisattvas and praying to all sorts of exalted beings to make it happen in such a way that this field gives rise to a harvest. If you ask whether this is a viable possibility or if it is even possible, it's clear that it's not. Nothing will happen.
기시 sabyon meba che nyuguke 상계기 수여바이나 안간조 사변의 nyugun이 균대에 뭐 타쳐 맞다. 사변 매번 nyuguke 거서도 nyuguke 걸 사변 고말 인지미지. 이 사변 nyugu 규레스 간조 다 단다 결혼도 균대 충어 쇠 뭐디 리글럼도 게르다.
If in the absence of a seed the Buddha could come in and suddenly magically make a sprout manifest from that field, then you cannot say a seed is the cause of sprout anymore. Because in the absence of a seed, you can still have a sprout, so there's no relation between the two. At which point, everything that you have been debating in terms of causality, cause and effect, that gets invalidated. And at that point, then if you ask what the cause of a sprout is, you need to start thinking again. But all these farmers outside, they're pretty aware and they do accept that seeds are the cause of the harvest.
선상 군주 신간낭라 사변 마담 님명람 개임인도와 사변 답 추답 류답 다시 된도 야부게 오셨으면 얘기도 디디고 왔다.
So all of these farmers, they do pray. Of course, they do pray that they'll have a good harvest, but they don't pray without having planted seeds. They plant the seed, they till the soil, they ensure that all the conditions are met, and after all of those are met, then they make prayers that they may have a good harvest. That kind of prayer is all right, it's valid.
다 사싱주도와 딩아조기 소소 셈들에 심규들에 사변데 가르스나 나랑 속이 냠내 쳐야 됐다. 나랑도 소소 심규랑이 냠내 쳐야 돼. 딩이 냠도 초어제 아니 가지고 mellam 잡초다. 상계의 장주sem발 가리 mellam 잡지 최냠내 야구 용화다 다르심바다 발심이요 가리 mellam 게는 디기었다. 다디 수수기 심규디강라 수수기 디보뽕 개와 두고긴 딱 가리 냠내 가리 심규 냠내 가리 제국의 여바디 심기 냠내디 마체바이나 딱 가르몬 가르몰럼 잡대바이나 디부트에 요마다.
So this is an example. The meaning of the example is that the field is compared to one's own mind. The seed is compared to one's practice. Whatever practice one is doing. So I think practice, but like whatever one is cultivating, I think that's more important here. Then once you've cultivated a practice, so you're engaging in something, then whatever aspirations or prayers you might do, may I have this realization of Bodhicitta, may I have a realization of emptiness, loving kindness, whatever you might do, that's all right. But without having a practice or without doing something with one's mind, sitting there and making all of these incredible prayers and aspirations without doing anything or without cultivating any practice is like hoping for a field without a seed to give rise to a harvest.
소장아주 낭비최 다 대선 낭바 인생에 낭비최 진행에 망고지 다라로와 가주 고야 가리고 거라 가주 고야디 tarbe lam di kukorwa. So tarbe lam gozugu di ngejungi saban gozugu orboda. Ngejungi samba gyule kene tarbe lam gozugu yore. Tongni tobe sherab gyule kene nyemon panyang gozugu yore. Chanjugi sem gyule kene ani sangi sala droya gozugu yore. Ta ngazu goye dikora. Ngazu sangi sala drogo tarbal drogo nyemon pangu yose goroda. Gozugu sadi diredo. Ngejung shansa yanda taosum diredo. Ta di nyamne sosogi chigi chigime. 디기 미남 종기 메나 니종기 상박이 미남 종 장주기 셈기 미남 종 돈이 따와 미남 종기 여바이나 다 사신디가라 사변 답기였다 다 된도 깨마게 당기 라오나시 기긴 객체에다 가리는 용세게다 간다 사변 답기였다 다디 지기 메나르다 디 숨보디 지기 메바이나 아니 심규디낭로라 타르베기 사변 답기 요 말에 상기 고방기 사변 답기 요 말. 답기 매바이나 땅아조 타르바토브 쇼스 상기 고방 토브 쇼스 세제 가즈기 멸람 잡아이나 멸람데다 아주 디나시 당기 라오나시 레와 동과세시도 어디 차됐다.
When we talk about Buddhist practice, when the practice that we're talking about is Buddhist practice, then the basic fundamental practices are all with the intention of attaining Buddhahood or liberation. And so the cause or the seed for attaining liberation is when one has got renunciation or definitive emergence, I think is better. When one has cultivated this mind or one is cultivating this mind. The causes to start removing the afflictions and self-grasping and ignorance is when one is cultivating the practice of wisdom. When one is practicing to attain Buddhahood or one wishes to attain Buddhahood, then the seed or the practice that develops into it is the practice of Bodhicitta. So if the results that we aspire are liberation and Buddhahood, the causes for it or the seeds are the cultivation of definitive emergence, wisdom, of selflessness, and bodhicitta. Now each one ask ourselves and see if we're cultivating these three. And by cultivating these three means that one is actively practicing them and actively focusing on their object and making the mind stronger. If one is doing these three, then one has planted the seeds for these two effects. And like the seed in a field, the fact that there may be obstacles and there may be something that comes in the way or lengthens it is all possible. But one has planted the seeds for those three. Without cultivating the practice of these three, praying to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas saying, may I generate compassion, may I generate Bodhicitta, may I generate renunciation, may I develop the wisdom of emptiness, is like in the case of the seed where one has empty hopes, empty aspirations, empty words.
다 디기 가리 단도 빼다 디 자니 셰샤 디기 된다 닝보 가리 소소 가리 제고 유메디 소소 가리 제고 유메디다 세우 차회를 와였다.
So by giving this example and illustrating what it should mean, I hope it's clear. I hope it's a clear answer to the question of what one should be doing or what one should not be doing.
소소 나라 가리 고유 네 가리 제고래세 디니부디 다 세우 차르고다.
So what is it that I want? What is it that I have to do to get it? This should be clear. Right now, this should be clear.
디 세우 차 소마이나 아니 당길라고 나시레 비장가 두근 디기 가와 내가 제가 두 디기 가리 제바 있는 디 nga goyedi di nge che goyedi di se semi surdine yobeina choda khateg marta.
If this is clear and one's idea is I want this and this is what I need to do to get it, then if one wishes for this, then whether one goes to study, one goes to back to one's job, one goes to learn Tibetan, whatever one does, if in the corner of one's mind this is a wish that one has, that this is what I want, this is how I have to go to get there, this ensures that you will never be separated from the Dharma.
어떤 드레시야? 점배보 운치들 캠바도 군도 상보 대양 대신데 대다 군기 지소다로 지겨와 디다 탐제라도 두숨셰빈 겨와 탐제지 뭐 칸라 초도 유저와 대군장 상보 주지라도